My name is Dell Deaton, and I'm author-creator of the JamesBondWatches.com website and blog. Following is part 2 of 6 of my presentation on James Bond watches to the 64th Annual Convention of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors in Grand Rapids, Michigan on June 13, 2009. Picking up where we left off, we're going to complete addressing in this part the two criticisms of James Bond films recently and James Bond watches in general, the first one regarding product placements and the second one regarding gadgets. This slide is titled Buy Another Day, and this relates to the 2002 James Bond film titled Die Another Day with Pierce Brosnan, the complaint being that there were just too many brand names, too many product placements in that film for critics' comfort. And of course you see here flying onto the screen a number of brands that over the years have been associated with James Bond. We'll continue then. You'll see a number of titles that associate themselves with those brands. The thing that's important here, the point that I want to emphasize, is that these titles are of Ian Fleming novels or short stories as opposed to movies. And I'd like to read to you what it is that Ian Fleming himself wrote when it came to regard to why it is that he felt brand names were important. This is from an article titled How to Write a Thriller, published in August 1962, Show magazine. He explains the strategic importance of brand references as follows. They allowed him to write stories to a higher realm of fantasy because the constant use of familiar household names and objects reassures the reader that he and the writer have both still got their feet on the ground. If there is a hedonistic streak in places or things, it is always there to offset the grimmer side of Bond's adventures. In other words, these brand names anchor fantasy in reality and allow Ian Fleming to sweep the reader along through his stories. It's a strategic and a vital thing to include. This slide looks at how it is that the number of brands as they relate to watches actually spread out in the number of films. There are 22 Ian Productions films so far. One of the things that I want to emphasize here, you can look in the center of this graph and see that Rolex is in the lead. What's important though is this second from the top graph, which indicates that in the second place, tied with, it looks like Omega at this point, there are at least as many unidentified brands as there are identified brands when it relates to watches in the films. The gold case light dial Sylvia Trench watch that introduced Sean Connery as James Bond in his very first scenes shown in Dr. No. The Osaka Chemical watch in You Only Live Twice, the Peter Franks watch, which played such a critical, vital importance in the elevator fight leading up to that. James Bond checks his watch and diamonds are forever. The Gibraltar watch, the light-dialed watch with the black case, black bracelet that was in the pre-title sequence of The Living Daylights. So it's not always that brands are featured predominantly in these films. As a matter of fact, many times they are not. You can take this information and look at what you've got here and see it in perspective and form your own conclusion whether this is excessive or not excessive. The first James Bond watch. I'm wondering, or I asked in my presentation, how many people would actually know what this was. It did feature a Geiger counter. This was for Operation Thunderball, as it was titled. The year, however, was 1961, and the originator of this watch was Ian Fleming itself. The book here on the left is Ian Fleming's author's copy of Thunderball that he kept. It's currently archived at the Lilly Library, Indiana University at Bloomington. And this was a photograph actually that I took in conjunction with the Ian Fleming Centenary on May 28, 2008. This next slide then looks at the number of appearances by gadget and how it is that they spread out over time, beginning with the first Gadget Watch appearance in Thunderball, continuing to the last Gadget Watch appearance in Die Another Day. You can see that there are a number of different gadget watches across here, the tracker watch, messaging watch, the magnetic watch, the Garrote, the exclusive related. As I'm ranking these, a couple of information points that I emphasized during my original presentation. I only gave half a point to the TV watch because that was actually a consumer available product at the time by Seiko. The Garrote watch, that was actually also a Seiko watch, a modified diverse watch, but it only appeared in the outtakes You only knew that it had a garrote apparatus from Russia, a la From Russia with Love, when James Bond is sprung from jail by M after the Paris sequence. The question then, in the larger context, is how did Ian Fleming most utilize James Bond watches? How was it aside from brands? How was it aside from gadgets? And the answer is to tell time. There were approximately 100 watch references in the books. 2/3 of these tell nothing more than the time. The reason for this is that books have no sound, they have no special effects, they have no ability to control readers' pacing. Ian Fleming, as an author in his day, was a blockbuster author by the time the later books were coming out, certainly. And this is how it is that he controlled readers' pacing, by pitting his protagonist against the clock. I asked in my presentation how many people who had seen the actual movie Casino Royale but not read the novel contemplated how long the torture sequence went on, and my guesses were anywhere from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. And I almost got a universal show of hands when I asked people if they were sympathetic or empathetic with the character. Did you wince? Ian Fleming again manages time here by noting that in the book the torture lasted 1 full hour, and he tells us this 3 times. Again, manipulation of time as a key element of building his stories. This slide then is actually from the Live and Let Die manuscript. We can look on here and see the words as Ian Fleming typed them in 1953 on his portable, and we can see here that when he went back apparently to revise them, and we're going to guess that that was later in the day with his blue ink pen, as was his habit, that he adjusted the time from 11:30 p.m. to 3 minutes past 11 as seen above. The point that I want to emphasize here is that picking up those 27 minutes was that important to him. He had that level of interest and control in time as it related to writing a story. Continuing on then to my theme that I raised in the previous installment of this series, part 1, about whether James Bond's watch was really a Rolex watch, whether that really just married Ian Fleming as his James Bond character to the Rolex watch. By the time he got into the next novel, which was You Only Live Twice, the one that followed On Her Majesty's Secret Service with all of the Rolex references, Ian Fleming was back to using time as a mere tool for building tension. There is no reference to a Rolex watch in You Only Live Twice. However, he does have James Bond impersonating a Japanese fisherman who is deaf. He's kidnapped by Blofeld. Blofeld seats him on top of a volcano, or an open volcano chair, I think he called it the Stone Throne, and said, faced James Bond against the clock and said, in 5 minutes the volcano will erupt right beneath you. And the question is, if you are deaf and you really are Japanese, you will not jump, you will not sweat. However, if you are, as I suspect, James Bond, we will find that out very quickly. Protagonist against the clock was also very important in the films. I think of some of the best film sequences, the flashing Nixie tubes in the Goldfinger sequence where James Bond is trying to disarm the nuclear device among the gold bars trapped within Fort Knox. Or in the Living Daylights, the red LED timer counting down as James Bond is fighting against Negros. He goes out the back of the plane, comes back into the plane, and finds out that the one bag that did not fall out of the plane was the bag that has the bomb on it, and he has to disarm it just in the nick of time, which of course he does. That concludes part 2. Please continue to part 3.